Chapter 8. You Are Here. There's another sense in which treating time as something that we own and get to control seems to make life worse. Inevitably, we become obsessed with using it well, whereupon we discover an unfortunate truth. The more you focus on using time well, the more each day begins to feel like something you have to get through en route to some calmer, better, more fulfilling point in the future, which never actually arrives. The problem is one of instrumentalization. To use time, by definition, is to treat it instrumentally, as a means to an end. And of course, we do this every day. You don't boil the kettle out of a love of boiling kettles, or put your socks in the washing machine out of a love for operating washing machines, but because you want a cup of coffee or clean socks. Yet it turns out to be perilously easy to overinvest in this instrumental relationship to time, to focus exclusively on where you're headed, at the expense of focusing on where you are, with the result that you find yourself living mentally in the future, locating the real value of your life at some time that you haven't yet reached, and never will. In his book, Back to Sanity, the psychologist Steve Taylor recalls watching tourists at the British Museum in London who weren't really looking at the Rosetta Stone, the ancient Egyptian artifact on display in front of them, so much as preparing to look at it later by recording images and videos of it on their phones. So intently were they focused on using their time for a future benefit, for the ability to revisit or share the experience later on, that they were barely experiencing the exhibition itself at all. And whoever watches most of those videos anyway? Of course, grumbling about younger people's smartphone habits is a favourite pastime of middle-aged curmudgeons like Taylor and me. But his deeper point is that we're all frequently guilty of something similar. We treat everything we're doing, life itself, in other words, as valuable only insofar as it lays the groundwork for something else. This future-focused attitude often takes the form of what I once heard described as the when I finally mind, as in, when I finally get my workload under control, get my candidate elected, find the right romantic partner, sort out my psychological issues, then I can relax, and the life I was always meant to be living can begin. The person mired in this mentality believes that the reason she doesn't feel fulfilled and happy is that she hasn't yet managed to accomplish certain specific things. When she does so, she imagines, she'll feel in charge of her life and be the master of her time. Yet in fact, the way she's attempting to achieve that sense of security means she'll never feel fulfilled, because she's treating the present solely as a path to some superior future state, and so the present moment won't ever feel satisfying in itself. Even if she does get her workload under control or meet her soulmate, she'll just find some other reason to postpone her fulfillment until later on. Certainly, context matters. There are plenty of situations in which it's understandable that people focus intently on the possibility of a better future. Nobody faults the low-paid cleaner of public restrooms for looking forward to the end of the day, or to a time in the future when he has a better job. In the meantime, he naturally treats his working hours mainly as a means to the end of receiving a paycheck. But there's something odder about the ambitious and well-paid architect, employed in the profession she always longed to join, who nonetheless finds herself treating every moment of her experience as worthwhile only in terms of bringing her closer to the completion of a project, so that she can move on to the next one, or move up the ranks, or move toward retirement. To live like this is arguably insane, but it's an insanity that gets inculcated in us early in life, as the self-styled spiritual entertainer and New Age philosopher Alan Watts explained with characteristic vigour. Take education. What a hoax. As a child, you're sent to nursery school. In nursery school, they say you're getting ready to go on to kindergarten, and then first grade is coming up, and second grade and third grade. In high school, they tell you you're getting ready for college, and in college, you're getting ready to go out into the business world. People are like donkeys running after carrots that are hanging in front of their faces from sticks attached to their own collars. They are never here. They never get there. They are never alive. The causal catastrophe. It took becoming a father for me to grasp how completely I'd spent my whole adult life up to that point mired in this future-chasing mindset. Not that the epiphany was instantaneous. Indeed, what happened first, as my son's birth approached, was that I became more obsessed than usual with using time well. Presumably every new parent, arriving home from the hospital to face the reality of their incompetence in the matter of child-rearing, feels some desire to spend their time as wisely as possible, first to keep the squirming bundle alive, and then to do whatever they can to lay the foundations for a happy future. But at the time, I was still enough of a productivity geek that I compounded my problems by purchasing several how-to books aimed at the parents of newborns. I was determined to make the very best use of those first crucial months. This genre of publishing, I soon realized, was sharply divided into two camps, each in a permanent state of indignation at the mere existence of the other. On the one side were the gurus I came to think of as the baby trainers, who urged us to get our infant onto a strict schedule as soon as possible, because the absence of such structure would leave him existentially insecure, and also because making his days more predictable would mean that he could be seamlessly integrated into the rhythms of the household. This would allow everyone to get some sleep, and my wife and me to swiftly return to work. On the other side were the natural parents, for whom all such schedules, and frankly the very notion of mothers having jobs to return to, were further evidence that modernity had corrupted the purity of parenthood, which could be recovered only by emulating the earthy practices of indigenous tribes in the developing world and/or prehistoric humans, these two groups being, to this camp of parenting experts, for all practical purposes the same. Later, I would learn that there's virtually no credible scientific evidence favoring either of these camps. For example, the proof that it's wrong to let your baby cry itself to sleep comes largely from research among infants abandoned in Romanian orphanages, which is hardly the same as leaving your child alone in their cosy Scandinavian bassinet for 20 minutes a day. Meanwhile, there's one West African ethnic group, the Hausa Fulani, who violate every Western parenting philosophy by deeming it taboo in some cases for mothers to make eye contact with their babies. And it seems those kids mostly turn out fine too. But what struck me most forcefully was how entirely preoccupied with the future both sets of experts were. Indeed, how virtually all the parenting advice I encountered, in books and online, seemed utterly focused on doing whatever was required to produce the happiest or most successful or economically productive older children and adults later on. This was obvious enough in the case of the baby trainers, with their passion for inculcating good habits that might serve a baby well for life. But it was no less true of the natural parents. It would have been one thing if the natural parents' justifications for insisting on baby wearing, or co-sleeping, or breastfeeding until age 3 had simply been that these were more satisfying ways for parents and babies to live. But their real motive, sometimes explicitly expressed, was that these were the best things to do to ensure a child's future psychological health. Again, no real evidence. And it struck me, rather more uncomfortably, that the reason I'd been seeking all this advice in the first place was because this was my stance on life too. That for as long as I could remember, my days had been spent striving for future outcomes. Exam results, jobs, better exercise habits, the list went on and on, in the service of some notional time when life would run smoothly at last. Now that my daily duties involved a baby, I'd simply expanded my instrumental approach to accommodate the new reality. I wanted to know that I was doing whatever was required to obtain optimal future results in the domain of child-rearing as well. Except that this now began to seem to me like an astoundingly perverse way to approach spending time with a newborn, not to mention an unnecessarily exhausting thing to have to think about when life was already exhausting enough. Obviously, it mattered to keep half an eye on the future. There would be vaccinations to be administered, preschools to apply to, and so forth. But my son was here now, and he would be 0 years old for only 1 year, and I came to realize that I didn't want to squander these days of his actual existence by focusing solely on how best to use them for the sake of his future one. He was sheer presence, participating unconditionally in the moment in which he found himself, and I wanted to join him in it. I wanted to watch his minuscule fist close around my finger and his wobbly head turn in response to a noise, without obsessing over whether this showed he was meeting his developmental milestones or not, or what I ought to be doing to ensure that he did. Worse still, it dawned on me that my fixation on using time well meant using my son himself, a whole other human being, as a tool for assuaging my own anxiety, treating him as nothing but a means to my hypothetical future sense of security and peace of mind. The writer Adam Gopnik calls the trap into which I had fallen the causal catastrophe, which he defines as the belief that the proof of the rightness or wrongness of some way of bringing up children is the kind of adults it produces. That idea sounds reasonable enough. How else would you judge rightness or wrongness? until you realize that its effect is to sap childhood of any intrinsic value by treating it as nothing but a training ground for adulthood. Maybe it really is a bad habit, as the baby trainers insist, for your 1-year-old to grow accustomed to falling asleep on your chest. But it's also a delightful experience in the present moment, and that has to be weighed in the balance. It can't be the case that concerns for the future must always automatically take precedence. Likewise, the question of whether or not it's okay to let your 9-year-old spend hours each day playing violent video games doesn't turn solely on whether or not it'll turn him into a violent adult, but also on whether that's a good way for him to be using his life right now. Perhaps a childhood immersed in digital blood and gore is just a lower quality childhood, even if there aren't any future effects. In his play, The Coast of Utopia, Tom Stoppard puts an intensified version of this sentiment into the mouth of the 19th century Russian philosopher Alexander Herzen, as he struggles to come to terms with the death of his son, who has drowned in a shipwreck, and whose life, Herzen insists, was no less valuable for never coming to fruition in adult accomplishments. Because children grow up, we think a child's purpose is to grow up, Herzen says. But a child's purpose is to be a child. Nature doesn't disdain what only lives for a day. It pours the whole of itself into each moment. Life's bounty is in its flow. Later is too late. The last time. And yet I hope it's clear by now that none of this applies only to people who happen to be the parents of small children. Certainly, it's true that a fast-developing newborn baby makes it especially hard to ignore the fact that life is a succession of transient experiences, valuable in themselves, which you'll miss if you're completely focused on the destination to which you hope they might be leading. But the author and podcast host Sam Harris makes the disturbing observation that the same applies to everything. Our lives, thanks to their finitude, are inevitably full of activities that we're doing for the very last time. Just as there will be a final occasion on which I pick up my son, a thought that appalls me, but one that's hard to deny since I surely won't be doing it when he's 30, there will be a last time that you visit your childhood home, or swim in the ocean, or make love, or have a deep conversation with a certain close friend. Yet, usually, there'll be no way to know, in the moment itself, that you're doing it for the last time. Harris's point is that we should therefore try to treat every such experience with the reverence we'd show if it were the final instance of it. And indeed, there's a sense in which every moment of life is a last time. It arrives, you'll never get it again, and once it's passed, your remaining supply of moments will be one smaller than before. To treat all these moments solely as stepping stones to some future moment is to demonstrate a level of obliviousness to our real situation that would be jaw-dropping, if it weren't for the fact that we all do it all the time. Admittedly, it's not entirely our own fault that we approach our finite time in such a perversely instrumental and future-focused way. Powerful external pressures push us in this direction too, because we exist inside an economic system that is instrumentalist to its core. One way of understanding capitalism, in fact, is as a giant machine for instrumentalizing everything it encounters: the Earth's resources, your time and abilities, or human resources, in the service of future profit. Seeing things this way helps explain the otherwise mysterious truth that rich people in capitalist economies are often surprisingly miserable. They're very good at instrumentalizing their time for the purpose of generating wealth for themselves. That's the definition of being successful in a capitalist world. But in focusing so hard on instrumentalizing their time, they end up treating their lives in the present moment as nothing but a vehicle in which to travel toward a future state of happiness. And so their days are sapped of meaning, even as their bank balances increase. This is also the kernel of truth in the cliché that people in less economically successful countries are better at enjoying life, which is another way of saying that they're less fixated on instrumentalizing it for future profit, and are thus more able to participate in the pleasures of the present. Mexico, for example, has often outranked the United States in global indices of happiness. Hence the old parable about a vacationing New York businessman who gets talking to a Mexican fisherman, who tells him that he works only a few hours per day and spends most of his time drinking wine in the sun and playing music with his friends. Appalled at the fisherman's approach to time management, the businessman offers him an unsolicited piece of advice. If the fisherman worked harder, he explains, he could invest the profits in a bigger fleet of boats, pay others to do the fishing, make millions, then retire early. And what would I do then? The fisherman asks. Ah, well, then, the businessman replies, you could spend your days drinking wine in the sun and playing music with your friends. One vivid example of how the capitalist pressure towards instrumentalizing your time saps meaning from life is the notorious case of corporate lawyers. The Catholic legal scholar Kathleen Kavney has argued that the reason so many of them are so unhappy, despite being generally very well paid, is the convention of the billable hour, which obliges them to treat their time, and thus really themselves, as a commodity to be sold off in 60-minute chunks to clients. An hour not sold is automatically an hour wasted. So when an outwardly successful, hard-charging attorney fails to show up for a family dinner or his child's school play, it's not necessarily because he's too busy in the straightforward sense of having too much to do. It may also be because he's no longer able to conceive of an activity that can't be commodified as something worth doing at all. As Kavney writes, lawyers imbued with the ethos of the billable hour have difficulty grasping a non-commodified understanding of the meaning of time that would allow them to appreciate the true value of such participation. When an activity can't be added to the running tally of billable hours, it begins to feel like an indulgence one can't afford. There may be more of this ethos in most of us, even the non-lawyers, than we'd care to admit. And yet, we'd be fooling ourselves to put all the blame on capitalism for the way in which modern life so often feels like a slog to be gotten through en route to some better time in the future. The truth is that we collaborate with this state of affairs. We choose to treat time in this self-defeatingly instrumental way, and we do so because it helps us maintain the feeling of being in omnipotent control of our lives. As long as you believe that the real meaning of life lies somewhere off in the future, that one day all your efforts will pay off in a golden era of happiness, free of all problems, you get to avoid facing the unpalatable reality that your life isn't leading towards some moment of truth that hasn't yet arrived. Our obsession with extracting the greatest future value out of our time blinds us to the reality that, in fact, the moment of truth is always now, that life is nothing but a succession of present moments culminating in death, and that you'll probably never get to a point where you feel you have things in perfect working order, and that therefore you had better stop postponing the real meaning of your existence into the future and throw yourself into life now. John Maynard Keynes saw the truth at the bottom of all this, which is that our fixation on what he called purposiveness, on using time well for future purposes, or on personal productivity, he might have said, had he been writing today, is ultimately motivated by the desire not to die. The purposive man, Keynes wrote, is always trying to secure a spurious and delusive immortality for his actions by pushing his interests in them forward into time. He does not love his cat, but his cat's kittens, nor in truth the kittens, but only the kitten's kittens, and so on forward forever to the end of catdom. For him, jam is not jam unless it is a case of jam tomorrow and never jam today. Thus, by pushing his jam always forward into the future, he strives to secure for his act of boiling it an immortality. Because he never has to cash out the meaningfulness of his actions in the here and now, the purposive man gets to imagine himself an omnipotent God whose influence over reality extends infinitely off into the future. He gets to feel as though he's truly the master of his time. But the price he pays is a steep one. He never gets to love an actual cat in the present moment. Nor does he ever get to enjoy any actual jam. By trying too hard to make the most of his time, he misses his life. Absent in the present. Attempting to live in the moment, to find meaning in life now, brings its own challenges too, though. Have you ever actually tried it? Despite the insistence of modern mindfulness teachers that it's a speedy path to happiness, and despite a growing body of psychological research on the benefits of savouring or making the deliberate effort to appreciate life's smaller pleasures, it turns out to be bewilderingly difficult to do. In his hippie classic, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Robert Pirsig describes arriving with his young son beside the blazing blue expanse of Crater Lake in Oregon, a collapsed prehistoric volcano that is America's deepest body of water. He's determined to get the most out of the experience, yet somehow he fails. We see the Crater Lake with a feeling of, well, there it is, just as the pictures show. I watch the other tourists, all of whom seem to have out-of-place looks too. I have no resentment at this, just a feeling that it's all unreal, and that the quality of the lake is smothered by the fact that it's so pointed to. The more you try to be here now, to point at what's happening in this moment and really see it, the more it seems like you aren't here now. Or alternatively that you are, but that the experience has been drained of all its flavour. I know how Pirsig must have felt. Several years ago, I visited Tuktoyaktuk, a small town in the extreme north of Canada's Northwest Territories. At the time, it was accessible only by air or sea, or in winter by the route I took, which involved travelling in an off-road vehicle along the surface of a frozen river, past ships immobilised in ice for the season, and then driving upon the frozen Arctic Ocean itself. My journalistic assignment concerned the fight between Canada and Russia for oil resources beneath the North Pole. But naturally, having heard so much about them, I also wanted to see the Northern Lights. Several nights running, I forced myself outside into minus 30 degrees Celsius cold, a temperature at which the moisture inside your nose turns to ice the moment you inhale, to find only the darkness of thick cloud cover. It wasn't until my last night there, shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, that the couple renting the neighbouring cabin at my bed and breakfast tapped excitedly on my door to tell me that the time had come. The Northern Lights were on display. I threw some clothes over my full-body thermal underwear and stepped out under a cathedral sky, filled with moving curtains of green light sweeping from horizon to horizon. I was determined to relish the exhibition, which the next morning locals would describe as a particularly impressive one. But the more I tried, the less I seemed able to do so. By the time I was getting ready to return to the warmth of my cabin, I was so far from being absorbed in the moment that a thought occurred to me regarding the Northern Lights, which to this day I squirm to recall. Oh, I found myself thinking, they look like one of those screensavers. The problem is that the effort to be present in the moment, though it seems like the exact opposite of the instrumentalist, future-focused mindset I've been criticising in this chapter, is in fact just a slightly different version of it. You're so fixated on trying to make the best use of your time, in this case, not for some later outcome, but for an enriching experience of life right now, that it obscures the experience itself. It's like trying too hard to fall asleep and therefore failing. You resolve to stay completely present while, say, washing the dishes, perhaps because you saw that quotation from the best-selling Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh about finding absorption in the most mundane of activities, only to discover that you can't, because you're too busy self-consciously wondering whether you're being present enough or not. The phrase, "be here now," calls to mind images of bearded stoners in bell-bottomed pants, utterly relaxed about whatever's happening around them. Yet in fact, the attempt to be here now feels not so much relaxing as rather strenuous. And it turns out that trying to have the most intense possible present moment experience is a surefire way to fail. My favourite example of this effect is the 2015 study by researchers at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, in which couples were instructed to have sex twice as frequently as usual for a 2-month period. At the end of this time, the study concluded, they weren't any happier than they had been at the start. This finding was widely reported as demonstrating that a more active sex life isn't as enjoyable as you might have imagined, but what it really shows, I'd say, is that trying too hard to have a more active sex life is no fun at all. A more fruitful approach to the challenge of living more fully in the moment starts from noticing that you are, in fact, always already living in the moment anyway, whether you like it or not. After all, your self-conscious thoughts about whether you're sufficiently focused on washing the dishes, or whether you're enjoying the extra sex you're having these days since agreeing to participate in that psychology study, are thoughts arising in the present moment too. And if you're inescapably already in the moment, there's surely something deeply dubious about trying to bring that state of affairs about. To try to live in the moment implies that you're somehow separate from the moment, and thus in a position to either succeed or fail at living in it. For all its chilled-out associations, the attempt to be here now is therefore still another instrumentalist attempt to use the present moment purely as a means to an end, in an effort to feel in control of your unfolding time. As usual, it doesn't work. The self-consciousness you experience when you seek too effortfully to be more in the moment is the mental discomfort of attempting to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps, to modify your relationship to the present moment in time, when in fact that moment in time is all that you are to begin with. As the author J. Jennifer Matthews puts it in her excellently titled short book, Radically Condensed Instructions for Being Just As You Are, we cannot get anything out of life. There is no outside where we could take this thing to. There's no little pocket situated outside of life to which we could steal life's provisions and squirrel them away. The life of this moment has no outside. Living more fully in the present may simply be a matter of finally realizing that you never had any other option but to be here now.